Hi, Nick. Good to see you. And I'm really excited to talk about your new book, The Local, published by Mack, coming out this week, I believe, officially, even though it's already in some stores and in some people's homes. So yeah, I thought it would be a good idea to start off just by acknowledging the fact that we've known each other for more than 25 years. I think we first met in our high school dark room way back when. And so, yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that and say, I'm really grateful for that long friendship and relationship, and really grateful to have your book as well, because it kind of brings me back to a place I know well. So, to a certain extent, this talk is going to verge on the very personal, and I think, um, the book definitely resonates with me on a personal level, in that sense of really understanding that area and kind of having grown up there. But maybe you could just talk a little bit about your relationship to this part of Western Massachusetts and the kind of genesis of this particular project.
Sure. And thanks for this. It's nice to see you. Yeah, I mean, so I've lived here now for over 30 years, moved here when I was a kid from New York. But so it's always been home in some sense. I've moved away for various moments here and there, but it's always sort of been a magnet to come back here, even every summer and in between weekends and all of that. It's always had that sort of place for me. So much so that like when I finished grad school, it was sort of between here and New York City, and in the end I sort of opted for the less glamour and less of a career here, but it's the only place I've ever really felt at home. And so I've never, I mean, other than high school, which you might remember, but it was sort of a common thing to wander around and just photograph as we do in high school. And so that was my my upbringing in photography, was sort of wandering around mostly Greenfield, which is not where I live, but where I spend a lot of my time. It's where I am right now. And through college and various teachers here and there, I veered away from that style of working, sort of, for lack of a better word, like street work. And it was actually, I mean, it's a longish story, but when I finished my last book, or it was finishing it, I was kind of in a gray area of what to do photographically, trying to figure out. And that the last book was much more sort of focused on my own life and the people in my life, and a lot about life changes and people dying and people growing up. And as that book was ending, I realized like that my life wasn't photographically interesting to me anymore, or it was more important for me to keep that for myself. But it was mostly an exercise just to sort of like energize myself. I started wandering around and kind of going back to places I remembered going in high school, going onto the railroad tracks and all these places that were, had that sort of, you'd have that adrenaline for kind of sneaking into places and asking people to photograph them, which was for this project, really a big hump for me to get over because I hadn't done it in so long. But then what was the last book came out in 2017, right? In April of 2017.
Yeah, that was called Limits and Contradictions. Is that right?
Either Limits or Contradictions. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, the world had we've just entered into this new era that, especially here in this country, that felt really uncertain. And it was, so as that book was coming out, and I was really excited for the fanfare of all of that, it also, the work felt very sort of tone deaf, I guess. I stand behind the work still, but looking at that work, it felt like I wasn't doing enough to sort of participate in the world. And so then as this exercise kind of kept on growing, I was looking more at the work a little bit more critically. It's like what it was doing to the world. And I think I had this idea when I was starting out that it was this bigger project that somehow was talking about the politics and all of these big things. And I wanted to be part of that conversation. And it was, I think that the big thing that was happening right around then was the border, the people being detained at the border, and there was a lot of photographers who were going down there to photograph that. And I had a desire to do that, but through sort of personal limitations, I wasn't really able to travel that much. And so I started looking more closely at what was around here. And this area, what's always been fascinating to me about it, and even before now, is that there's these two sort of highways that go through here. That's the one that goes from Boston out to, I guess, Albany is the way you'd call it, and then New York up to Maine. And that there's that weird crisscross that happens. And on Route 2, which is going east-west, there's it's an old, it's got like an old vacation style to it. There's all these old like roadside attractions, but it's also got a really crazy sort of socioeconomic difference from town to town. And that's always interested me. And then 91, which goes north-south, which is more of just a major highway, that highway currently is being used sort of as an auxiliary drug trafficking highway. And that's been going on now for the, I don't know, however long, past, getting worse and worse and better and worse. And I think now we're in a worse stage again. But what happens with those roads, and it's happening here, it happens in New Hampshire. I mean, it happens throughout the US, but these small towns where these it passes through, they always get hit really hard, and there isn't the infrastructure to keep it up. So that's been happening more and more in this area, and I've been seeing it more and more. And it's actually, I always think of you when I think of this, because in the police blotter in the paper, which has always been sort of a joy to look at here because it's so humorous and benign, it's gotten pretty dark. It's actually gotten a lot darker over the past 10 years for all those reasons. And it's, there's every now and again you catch that, somebody moving worms out of the street type of thing, but a lot of it is more because of drug stuff or domestic stuff. And so somehow I was trying to relate that all back to the politics. And it was, I mean, I think it was related to the politics. It wasn't the major issue at the time, but it was certainly, it felt more like Trump's America at that point. And so I think that's what I started photographing. But I think, it was, I actually, there was like what was it, January 19th was the day after he was inaugurated. There was a big protest right in town. And, that was originally part of the book.
Yeah.
But somehow there was like pieces that didn't fit. And that was one of them. It felt too all over the place. Yeah.
And that's what's really fascinating about this particular book, is that it kind of it alludes to a lot of those kinds of issues, the politics, the kind of drug problems, the socioeconomic problems in that kind of region, but it also feels intensely personal. Like it doesn't feel like reportage as much as it's much more about the kind of feel and the atmosphere. And I think that's, for me, having come from that place, but also just, I think generally for most viewers who are familiar with these kind of down and out industrial towns all around America and all around, the world to a certain extent, that there's a very specific kind of like heavy mood or atmosphere, a kind of real sense of a real tension kind of in the space. And I think your book, although the kind of content of the images, the subject of the images kind of alludes to those things, it's also about the kind of the tone and the texture and the light and the kind of gloom.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that's what eventually sort of happened with that. Like, I think I realized sort of early on in doing it that I'm running away from myself as much as I try, I can't do it. And so much of it was kept on coming back to me and my experience here, and that my own history rather than the actual. I mean, there is the town's history, there's the socioeconomic stuff, but it's much more about me experiencing that. And that's once I sort of like came to that conclusion, I think that's where it found itself seated a lot more comfortably, because and there's things. I mean, I should note that what I'm photographing here is not a full picture of this area. As there's Emily Dickinson down the road. I mean, there's a lot of this other stuff that is here. But for me, that was part of it, was sort of finding the places that I'd willfully been ignoring,
Yeah.
and trying to better understand that for myself, and how I fit into that. And so that, I think, is, that's where that sort of personal side, and I think it took over. I mean, I think that became the dominant narrative for me, was about how I personally can find myself within that.
Right. Right.
And that moved it a lot away from the sort of documentary style of working that I think I'm actually a failure at. So
I wouldn't say that so much, but I think, yeah, I think you're obviously sensitive to your own place within that community and within that environment as well. I think, just to talk about specifically in the book, I mean, you set the stage right at the start. There's a really heavy hitting kind of prologue almost. It's kind of a unusual prologue in that you have kind of 4 photographs before you even get to the title of the book.
Mhm.
So you have these kind of pretty heavy hitting images, from kind of roadkill to a rusty car to a kind of guy that looks pretty down on his luck, and then this kind of like faded mural of this town that was kind of the idyllic mural of the town, but having kind of weather beaten, and then you get into it. So yeah, maybe you could just talk a little bit about that kind of, that opening, and the decisions behind, really just diving the viewer or the reader kind of straight in, with a pretty hard hitting punch in the face in a way.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was always like that sort of, I really like that sort of cinematic feeling of that, where you don't really know where you are. You're kind of thrown into that confusion, and but even before you sort of get the opening credits, the starring credits, that you're sort of given that. And I have to, the full disclosure is that I had sort of I had a more confusing opening, but more of a place setting. And in editing with Michael and Morgan, we came to sort of that opening image, which is, a real gut punch. And it does. I mean, it was. I think I was going for the same thing, but Michael saw it as a little bit harder, and it was a good choice. I had my opening image originally was this sort of an aerial view of Greenfield here, of this town, that was foggy and kind of hard to see, and it was I was looking for that sort of drone shot, the crane shot,
Yeah,
overlooking
the like establishing shot kind of. Yeah.
right, exactly. And yeah, I think where it came to is much stronger. And there was that, yeah, and the sort of faded mural takes place of that setting
Yeah.
shot, and it has a lot more of that intensity. But it was, yeah, I think that the way that in editing, when I'm putting images together, I am thinking a lot about how that sort of cinema, that like I'm looking at movies. I'm terrible at editing footage. I can't do it. I can't think linearly like that. But when editing pictures, it has a lot to do with how that story is told. So I really like that sort of where am I, what's about to happen
Yeah.
experience that then leads
Yeah.
you to that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I get the real sense when I go through the book also, there actually aren't that many kind of establishing shots or kind of long shots in the book. It feels, it's quite tight and claustrophobic, and even that mural shot is like, it's a flat wall that you're kind of confronted with. There's not a huge amount of distance there. And when you do photograph kind of a bit more space or distance or architecture, often, I mean, there's one photograph of a couple of people kind of like hemmed in by all of this kind of architecture and kind of space in a sense. So for me at least, the book has a real sense of that kind of claustrophobic feel, and right up close portraits, details, in your face in a sense. And I was wondering if that kind of in any way, either consciously or subconsciously, was reflecting your own kind of feelings about that place, or about your place within this particular kind of community.
That, I mean, I don't think I really thought about that too much. I mean, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. And certainly I was just going through it actually, and I realized, like, pretty much all the portraits are at this almost, 3-foot distance.
Yeah.
But I mean, for me, like that, a lot of that was really just logistics and nerves, that it was, I'd start talking to somebody and I didn't want to take up too much of their time.
Yeah.
but there is also, I think, what ends up happening a lot in that, how they are often just sort of situated in front of a wall. Like, I mean, it was also important that they were part of that sort of fabric, how they kind of sometimes almost blend into the background, or the background blends into them, and that was an important part of that. I mean, there's, again, in earlier edits, there was more, I was really nervous about being too critical in my editing. So there was a lot more sort of open spaces, because, you know, I mean, there's a lot of beautiful areas around here, and I think that was that same thought about, I need to include all of this, and it ended up pulling back a lot on that, because it would just kind of watered it down. And it's, I think about it a lot, about that. And that's, like, again, that opening shot, which was this sort of, I mean, it still functioned, but it was about sort of opening the space up to let you know where you are. And here, the way it is now, it kind of keeps you situated within that unknown space. Or, you know, ambiguous space. And that has also been important for me, because, like, I think that there's, you know, it's a very personal space to me, and it has all this meaning, but I really, it's important to have an entrance for anybody. And I think if it gets too specific, which sometimes that open space can do, it becomes too much. This sounds contradictory, but it becomes too much about that place.
Right. Yeah, no, I get that. I mean, yeah, this definitely feels like a, you know, the way in which you're describing and interacting with this place, that it, you know, it is a very specific place that you have a very direct relationship with, but it also speaks to a kind of much broader kind of landscape, and, you know, cultural phenomenon that's going on within the States at the moment. And maybe it's worth touching upon that idea of, you know, obviously there's this kind of long-standing tradition or lineage, in particularly in American photography, of what's been called social documentary, I guess, which is that idea of kind of going into a community that might be down on its luck or hard hit or whatever. You know, everybody from Jacob Riis to Lewis Hine to, I mean, I think the FSA kind of set it in stone, that real tradition of going to places that are struggling politically, I mean, you know, economically or otherwise. So yeah, how do you feel like this work sits within that tradition versus, I don't know, responds to that tradition, and maybe takes it in another direction?
I mean, it's an interesting question, because I certainly, you know, I spent a lot of time grappling with, you know, this idea of documentary photography, or you know, what, like, you know, like Jacob Riis is wonderfully problematic. You know, I mean, there's so much problem to what he was doing, and how much ego, and, like, you know, the sort of, you know, the white savior idea, as well as Lewis Hine, although I'd say Lewis Hine was a little more successful in what he was doing. But yeah, I mean, I think that for me, that idea, like, I've sort of stuck by this philosophy, photographic philosophy, that you know, it's all a lie. You know, just as much as it is, like, Jacob Riis kicking in a door with a flash and taking a picture, like, there's no story there, right? And that's sort of what's beautiful about photography, is that the story, it lives within the picture, and or the lie lives within the picture. And that's more important to me than sort of the sort of truth telling of it. So I don't think of it, and I don't think of myself, you know, and I think that there's a lot of people that this is sort of a conversation that goes on right now, is like, that label of documentary photographer is problematic, and it's not really for the photographer to come up with that, you know, what kind of style they are. But I mean, this idea of responding to it, I guess, is part of it. I mean, that's my response, is that I think that, you know, there's sort of an amazing thing that, you know, in any picture that I've ever taken, there's this whole litany of things that came before, and a whole possibility of what's going to come after that moment. And there's also this reality, like when taking a portrait, that I'm having conversations, I'm talking to people, and that is not necessarily what's coming through in the photograph, and that's not necessarily what I want to come through in the photograph. And so that it's that fantasy that I'm more interested in. And I think that in the end, I mean, this is why I like making books. I think that is when you put that that sequence together in one image after the other, that's the narrative, like a partial fiction. It's like, based in reality, but this partial fiction that is created by
there's a kind of subjective author's voice kind of coming through.
Right. And that's where I find myself. And so I think like that would be my response. I certainly, came from that background of that, like, this is what a photograph should do. It should save the world. And of course, there's a much bigger conversation now about who gets to photograph what. And it's important to sort of, for me at least, to really understand where I fit in that, and how, like, what's appropriate for me to be doing and where I'm crossing lines. And it's also important for me to recognize when I am crossing lines and how I navigate that, because there's definitely moments, I don't think it's possible for anyone to make work without maybe, at least pushing up against those limits. And it's important for me to recognize that. Like how I'm entering this work, and I can say that this work is all about me, but clearly I've like relied on an entire county to make this work. And how I fit into that, right? And certainly a lot of people and places that I'm photographing are, like I said, like that's the part of the world that I was ignoring. It's not where I came from. And so there's that question of do I have authorship over that?
Right.
And I think it's a really tricky question. And I mean, for me, like, how I've entered that is that I've been able to, for me, it was a learning experience. And maybe that's a little bit sort of apologetic on my, or trying to make apologies, but that I did learn a lot, and I certainly, like, a lot of the people I photograph are people who I still talk to. And, that it was the sort of the medium became this bridge for me to enter into a world that I otherwise would have walked away from. And that to me is more important than saying that I'm not allowed to do this because XYZ.
Yeah, no, I mean, that definitely comes through in the portraits. I think with a lot of the kind of the other images, the landscapes and the details, and still lives, and all of those shots, they have a very kind of metaphoric, symbolic kind of position within the book. But when you kind of turn a page and encounter, a real person, a face, a human being, something all of a sudden kind of jumps out of the book, and it becomes a little bit more real and a little bit less kind of psychological, and maybe a bit more immersive on a kind of literal level. And I think what's important for me when you were talking about that was that idea that you maintain relationships with these people, you live in this community, you're not a photographer who's kind of pulling into town, taking a few pictures, and then leaving town and never seeing those people again. It's not Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother, or Walker Evans hanging out with some sharecroppers for a week and then disappearing. So you do have to, to a certain extent, you have a responsibility, and you have to live with the consequences of having made those pictures by the fact that you have to, that you inevitably see these people on a almost daily, if not weekly basis in your town. So I think that's a really important aspect, and I think it really helps make the portraits, at least for me, even if people don't know that backstory, there's a real sense of connection and direct kind of interaction and engagement there. It doesn't feel in any way kind of I don't know, looking down on people or looking at them as objects rather than subjects. So I think that really comes through. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I know that you've done some other kind of side projects whilst doing this project that were kind of serving that community as well, that you did a newspaper called The Common, I believe. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how that kind of fed into this project as well.
Yeah, and well, I mean, that was, it was definitely born out of this, because I was already working on this. And it was a very pointed moment of something that happened in town. The sort of, I mean, what I thought it was really amazing, whether it was a protest or not, but I thought it ended up being a protest. But just the backstory to it was that there's a photograph that was in this book that I ended up also editing out because it was a little too on the nose, I think. But it was the first person I met who was introduced to me as homeless. And it's an interesting area in that because there is a very high, for a small town, small area, there's I think around 12 or 13,000 people here, and there's something like 200 or 300 homeless people. So you can do the math on that. But you don't, like, you see people who you are on those margins, but there's a couple encampments that I've seen out in the woods, and there's a few areas that are known, but it was always a curiosity of like where they stay. And I was talking to him, I asked him where he slept, and he said that he slept right on the town common, which is, it's a triangle. It's 30 by about 100 feet. It's just a little grass right in the middle of town, right next to town hall. And at that, I don't want to get too deep into this because I can really talk a lot about this, but it functions differently than, say, like a public park, because the public park actually is owned by the city, but the common, the way that it's written, is actually owned by the people. And it has a long history that goes back to farming in England even. And legally they had the right to sleep there. And so what he would do is he'd go and he'd roll out his sleeping bag and sleep, and then roll it up in the morning. But about a week after making that photograph, what started happening on the common was tents started popping up. And it started out as one or two, and it became this thing. It became a full-on encampment right in the center of town. And it was incredibly divisive. And that spoke a lot to the sort of political climate, and a lot to this area where there was some people who were sort of stopping by and bringing them like non-GMO corn, and then there's other people who were throwing job applications at them. And so it had this really intense thing. And of course, for me, I was really fascinated by it, and I thought it was like amazing what they were doing and really supportive of it. But I also was really aware of the sort of the photographic problems in that of photographing this, there were all these homeless people right there. But it went on for about 2 months, and for that, I eventually was able to sort of become part of that community, become their photographer.
Yeah.
And I would just be there every day, and I photographed them. I was friends with them. But I also I didn't want to use those photographs as like the way I use photographs in the local, because it wasn't about that work I never felt was about me.
Right.
It just felt important, especially because of the divisive nature that was going on, that to do something, I felt like it was that feeling of needing to do something. So in making that newspaper, I actually was able to sell it at the farmers market, which happens right there on the common, which was always a really interesting thing that summer, where there was people buying their local produce right next to people who were sleeping in tents. And all that money, I was able to raise that money and then give it back. And so I still have it for sale on my website, and anything that I make off that, which is very little these days, but that just goes right back there. And that's the purpose of it. But I mean, what I did get out of that was, I met some really great people, but I also was able to, it gave me a lot of clarity about what I was doing with the local. And it helped me sort of position. It was a big break. It took sort of 2 months off of even thinking about working on that project to be fully immersed in this. But it certainly gave me a lot, especially like in how I was photographing people for the local. It made me realize how important that connection was, that I was already doing it, but in like really stopping and slowing down to have conversations, to like at least get to know them a little bit, And
are there particular kind of like portraits that are in the local? Maybe you could give us the backstory behind maybe one or two of the individuals that actually feature in the local.
Sure. Well, I mean, the one that's sort of there's two people in that have died, and they both had a really profound effect on me. And the first one was this her name is Nikita, which I actually learned later. And it was one of the first portraits I made, and certainly was one of these, you know, just take a deep breath and ask. And I fully admit that I was, you know, not just terrified to ask her to take a picture, but actively sort of afraid of her, coming from a completely different world. And it was, well, I mean, and that the moment was incredibly brief in that situation. It was a simple, can I take your picture? And a yes, and then moving on. And which was, you know, for me, that like, it has, you know, I always, there's that feeling of, as a photographer, that I did it, you know, that, but you know, she was somebody who was around every day. You know, you'd see her on the street every day, and people, you know, she was very striking, and people recognized her. But I never talked to her again, and we never actually, you know, acknowledged that. But I would see her, and there was that connection that moment had, that sort of like softened my own fear to her. And then it was actually, I think, just this fall, I read in the paper that she'd passed away, and it was like a really weird moment to sort of like to have to come to terms with, like a weird sense of grief. And you know, I shouldn't, you know, I don't want to make that about me. It feels sort of, you know, it's not appropriate for me to make it about me, but I didn't know what to do. I mean, there was nothing to do, but I felt this sense of grief about losing this person who was just such a part of my daily experience, even though we didn't interact. And that was, that also, like, you know, that was 4 years after I took the picture. And that, you know, really realizing how that relationship, how that one moment formed this very abstract relationship. So that was like a really profound thing. But there was other ones that were, like a photograph of a woman with tattoos on her face. Her name's Elena. And I just, you know, it was very, you know, I asked her very directly, if she could tell me about that, not in a way that was, you know, like, why would you do that to yourself? But like, can I ask you about that? And she was incredibly open and warm. And you know, the story that she had gotten into an accident and had scarring on her face, and had covered them up with butterfly tattoos because she wanted something beautiful on her face. And you know, it's those kind of moments, and I do still see her around. And you know, where like that my initial attraction to her was obviously sort of very surface. And that's how I entered it, was this, you know, what makes this person different, what makes them interesting. But that experience for me is what made that photograph. And my only hope is that comes through in the photograph, that is my relationship to that photograph now is not about a woman with tattoos on her face. It's about this woman who has this story and gave me part of that story. And that's, you know, it's kind of going back to this idea that there is no before and after in a photograph, right? There is only what's there. But hopefully, as a photographer, from doing my job, that's in there somehow. And that sort of softens that. And that's always my intention, I think. You know, I definitely, like, I have an immediate attraction to people for whatever reason. You know, I think that's only natural. But I really want to go beyond that when I am talking to them now. And that's something I learned a lot from this work on the Common, that there's like so much more than two people, you know, and being part, like, and that moment that you share with them, you know, whether
for sure.
You know, if it's you know, reciprocated, it's there. So
yeah, and I'm wondering what the effect of that, those experiences and those encounters might have had on your kind of more general, like, overall perspective on the place and the kind of community. Because you write in the text, you say, "This is the only place that has ever felt like home to me. My entire life I've moved through Franklin County with an entitled sense of belonging and a false sense of understanding.
Mhm.
And so, I think in that text, you're kind of acknowledging that sense of, I don't know, entitlement, or a kind of, you say, a false sense of understanding, a false sense of belonging. So, and obviously the book kind of reflects, a less kind of nostalgic, view of the area than one that's like, oh, this is my hometown, and isn't it, great. So I'm wondering if maybe, I don't know, I'm trying to see the book through the perspective of you, where you're acknowledging this kind of sense of entitlement, or a sense of a misunderstanding that you've kind of awakened to, versus, I don't know, the experience and the perspective that many of the subjects of your portraits might have of the same town and the same environment, the same location.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it's that same, I mean, when certainly growing up here, it's, and knowing the topography of a place, right? Like I
Yeah.
know I can wander down the train tracks. I know these back alleys. I know these places, and I have known them for a long time. But that was still, it was sort of myopic. It was, just looking
Yeah.
at this one idea, and my idea, and so that in working this way, like, I've always felt like it's my town, right?
Yeah.
Certain
Yeah.
things, and it's a small town. It's like, I mean, that's the important thing to me is, and I think this is why part of why I don't do well in cities is being able to be recognized, like that I go into the same store and I get the same order and people know my name, like there is that, and that I think that was part of that entitlement, right? It's that I
Yeah.
have a presence here, and in working this way, it was going to that part of it that I've been ignoring, that I've kind of, working off that sense of entitlement, have wandered through here, sort of thinking I know the place, but
Mm.
don't. Um, and so it was about figuring out how I fit in, how that sort of sense of entitlement fits in, but also, coming to terms with how much I just didn't know,
Yeah.
and how much I was willfully, sort of ignorant to.
And how about in terms of, thinking about, obviously you're making these photographs on a very personal level, and in a sense for yourself, but you're also making them to be shown, to be published, to be exhibited. So what is it that you're actually trying to convey, in relationship to what we've just been talking about? What aspect of that are you trying to convey to the reader, the viewer, through both the individual photographs, but also through the kind of, like you said, the kind of narrative or the sequence, and the journey that you take us on in the book itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of like, it's, from that to me, is double-sided, because there's a part that was really important that is about knowing, knowing where I am, but also it being foreign. So it was a gray area. So there's moments where I want that sort of repetition. I want things to feel like I'm taking you for a walk with me over and over and over again.
Yeah.
That is how I made the book, was just daily kind of being like, I'm going to go wander over there. I'm going to go over here. I'm just going to do this today. And like over the course of 4 years, doing that over and over and over again. And whatever, if the light changed, if the people changed, like all of those things were very important.
Mm-hmm.
But as I think, I mean, that there, so I mean, I can talk about the title a little bit, I guess, but because that really actually informed a lot of what I was thinking about,
Yeah.
which is that it has that sort of, the way that the local works is it can be a person or a place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was really important. It was taken really directly from, I sort of ripped off that idea from William Carlos Williams's Patterson, where it's both the person and the place. And it was figuring out how they mesh, right? And so that's what I want the viewer to get, I think, is to have that experience of like just getting lost in a place that might feel familiar, or might feel foreign, or might feel, but learning about how they fit in. And
Yeah.
that was, I mean, if that's my elevator pitch, but it was also, I mean, I get really sort of annoyingly literary about this, because, you know, Patterson was sort of a response to The Wasteland, which is much darker, and is also sort of about somebody who is been living in a place but not from that place. And that was like the response was like, why don't you love this place? You know, that's
Right.
kind of in a very short way. That was what Patterson was about. It's like, this place may not, you know, be beautiful all the time, but it's still beautiful.
Yeah.
And that was kind of where I found myself, was sort of situated between that, because I definitely, you know, I am critical. I am being critical of a lot of this sort of deterioration, but I'm also very much aware that this is the only place that's been home, and it still
Yeah.
feels like that. And it,
Yeah.
you know, it doesn't, like, you know, that sort of, that, you know, the crumbling buildings and all of that it might be in the photographs are still part of where I am, and something that I love, you know. And
Yeah.
I mean, again, it's hard to sort of like, you know, definitely, I think on the surface can come off as sort of like, you know, it has that sort of, you know, ruin
Yeah.
quality to it, that we had, like, you know, the rust and everything. But I think a lot of that is stuff that I just, for me, is you know, they're signifiers of a place of being,
Yeah.
that I know where I am.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think also, I mean, maybe it would be interesting for you to talk a little bit more about other influences that you might have had, or other kind of sources of inspiration, because obviously Patterson and William Carlos Williams kind of feeds into that. Um, what other places were you looking for, both in terms of when you were shooting, but also in terms of when you were trying to conceive of the overall book itself and the narrative and so on? Where were you drawing kind of inspiration?
I mean, I think a lot of it for me was just, I mean, that starting it out was just kind of going back, you know, and also just photographing what was in front of me, what I, you know, other than my immediate in front of me, my family and my kids. It was and in many ways it was sort of escaping that, trying to get out of my immediacy.
Yeah.
But like I said, couldn't go photograph these more journalistic or documentary subjects that might have been sort of eating at me. So I mean, I think that was a inspiring factor, was like where the world was at. But it was, I think, once it was really the sort of finding that literary connection between those two texts that was where it would help me sort of form my ideas around it.
Hmm.
I mean, there's certainly plenty of visual aids around in the world that have led, you know, I mean, I could go on, and I won't, but
Yeah. Yeah.
it's I mean, I don't think I'm doing anything new in that regard, you know. I don't think that I think that there's for whatever reason, people are drawn to this type of thing, myself included. And you know, I couldn't tell you why.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but I mean, I think, like, for me also, there was a lot of it was going back to these sort of teenage years of almost, you know, almost getting in trouble, you know,
Yeah.
trespassing here and there, and confronting my own fears of people saying no to me, or, you know, like, that was always a thrill to, like, and still is, to, you know, when I ask somebody to take a photograph of them and they say yes, I feel like I've really, you know, I've earned my trophy. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, I think that's, I mean, it's hard for me to sort of like come up with other direct influences off on the fly like that, because
Yeah.
really, I felt a lot of, I still go back to it and I write about it a lot. It's kind of the boring side of it for me, but it means a lot when I go through these texts. I mean, it was really from Patterson, is in the first line of the author's note, is that a man in himself is a city.
Hmm.
Like, was actually the first line of the thing, and that stuck with me the whole time of doing it, was
Right.
that, like, how you just become part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. I think. I mean, I think we've had these conversations in the past as well, but for me at least, that particular part of America often is, you know, New England, or, you know, the Northeast is often overlooked within kind of, I don't know, the American road trip tradition or the American past. You know, there's a lot of people that travel from New York to LA, from Robert Frank to whomever, you know, or they go south. but very rarely do people go north and east, in terms of that canon of tradition. But that said, there are photographers that have kind of worked in that area in the past, including Stephen Shore and Walker Evans, and even Gregory Crutzen and Tim Davis and Justin Kimball, and so it's a region. I think I'm seeing this from my perspective of somebody who's living abroad, and people having a particular idea or a particular picture about America and what America is, which often resides more in that kind of those other parts of America. So I was just wondering if there was kind of anything in particular about that region or that place that you were trying to say, or were you trying to align it more with a kind of more general kind of idea? Is there something unique about this, Massachusetts in the Northeast versus, say, the Rust Belt, or other parts of other industrial kind of places?
No, I think it has more to do with that it's not unique. There's these, like you said, it's the Northeast, of course, is, and California, like there's the two coasts that have, it's where the population is. It's all of the, there's all this stuff there. And so that's the overlooked part of the country, the Midwest and the Rust Belt, all those areas certainly get drawn to. But there is also, I think, on a minute scale, and this very well, but this area is not just old industrial towns. There's the other name for 91 that runs up here, other than the Heroin Highway, is the Academic Corridor. So it's like, we have a lot of colleges. There's a lot of rural bohemians.
Yeah.
And of course, there's Boston is an hour and a half away. It's all here. But then when you sort of get down to the minutia of that, literally town to town, it changes wildly. And I think that was something that was interesting to me, for the same reasons that, the Rust Belt might be sort of overlooked on a grand scale, or the Midwest, that there's the same thing is happening on a smaller scale here. And of course, in Western Massachusetts here, growing up, we always joked about, wanting to secede from Boston because all the money goes to Boston.
Yeah.
And it's like, even like Boston's water supply, they flooded 4 towns in Western Mass so that they could have water.
Yeah.
There's sort of there is a history of the cities sort of just dominating the smaller towns around here, to where the towns, and these towns, they built the cities, where these factories were. I talk about the literally the industry that was here. The two major products were paper and tools. Mm-hmm. And in Greenfield particularly, it was tap and die. So like making literally the nuts and bolts that held this country together. And now that's gone. It was like completely overlooked in that way. So I think that there's a lot of relationship between something like, the broad America, the road trip, but it's just here. It's just within the same areas. And it's true, I think, everywhere. Yeah.
No, I think often New England is kind of pigeonholed as somewhere that's quite liberal and academic, and kind of, especially that area can sometimes get that kind of reputation for being quite like hippy dippy and like you said, bohemians in the woods kind of thing. So I think it's really interesting to kind of address the history of that place, and the kind of working class nature of a lot of those towns, and also the kind of the struggle that they're currently kind of engaged with as a result of the loss of that kind of industry and so on. Maybe the last thing to touch upon is that I think in the text you talk a little bit about, you say, as a kid, I only thought about leaving, wanting to be somewhere else, to become something else. And then later on, you kind of talk about, it's a town in stasis, but I'm part of it and it's a part of me. Mm-hmm. And I was just interested in that idea of stasis, because obviously, from my perspective, I'm kind of the opposite. Like I did think about leaving, and then I left, kind of as soon as I could when I was 17 years old, and kind of so that area and that particular part of the world and those towns and those very specific kind of sites and things that you're photographing, for me, are always associated with kind of childhood and teenage years and kind of a past. And when I return to them, I'm pretty uh, kind of streamlined in my thinking, the way that I see the place as being something that hasn't changed. I recognize the same shops and restaurants and people, that have always been there. But I think I also coming back, having lived abroad for so long, I also start to see the kind of changes that have taken place in that area as well. So I'm really interested in this idea of you thinking of it as a place that's in stasis.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, it's for that reason. I think that it's like, I mean, like anywhere, it's every year things change, and I could give examples, but there is that feeling that I mean, there's some places that, I mean, we're talking about the physical spaces, they do stay the same, and there are some amazing places here that have managed to sort of just exist for many years in a world that definitely doesn't require them. But that's a big part of it, I think, too, is that it's more than just like they do come and go, and places do move, there is change, but there's still this sort of, it maintains itself in a very sort of specific way, that it's not it's not growing skyscrapers, it's not like population isn't building, although that I think is changing now that people are realizing they can work remotely. But there's, I feel like it's, especially Greenfield here, it's kind of this, it's always been on the precipice of sort of feeling like it's something. There's a lot of anecdotes about that actually happening, like somebody being like, this town has so much character, I'm going to turn it around, and then it doesn't.
Yeah.
It always kind of feels like a stairway to nowhere type of thing that happens, and which isn't, I mean, it's one of these critical moments that I talk about a lot, where there's a lot of like, oh, we can do this, and it doesn't happen. And I think there is something about that that's beautiful to me, that it sort of like persists in its character, but there's also in some ways a lack of identity of trying to figure out where to go. I think a lot of that comes from these factories being, I mean, they haven't been here in my lifetime, actually. They've been closed down since the 50s or 60s, but that there is, where do you fit? And I also think that is positioned, and this is a big difference from, say, like the Rust Belt, where there's like, it may be miles and miles, is that, where we are here is very close to New York City. It's very close to Boston. It's not too far from Philadelphia. It's like, you're not that far away from these places, but it sort of stays here, it just kind of situates. And because of the colleges nearby, there's a real transience of people, a real transience of culture, where people are here for 4 years and then leave. Which and that may be changing actually now. I mean, I think that I'm starting to see more shifts around that than I have previous, but I also say that, and I've seen that happen a lot, and then it doesn't happen. So, there is that feeling. And then, like, I mean, just like what you said, like I had that feeling, I left here right as soon as I could. I moved to New York, but I also just got eaten up in New York. And that was that small town, like that Stasis is actually very comfortable. It's like, I think that when the world starts moving so fast, I get kind of dizzy.
Yeah.
And so this is like, it's just an easier place for me and a lot of people, I think, to find themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the book itself, in the local, there, like I said at the beginning, there is a sense of foreboding, or a certain sense of kind of heaviness in a lot of the pictures, but there's also something comforting that could be found in that kind of environment, because of its kind of the kind of common factors that seem to exist through the decades. I feel like when I go through the book, many of the pictures could have been taken in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s or the 2000s or yesterday. You know, there's a real kind of sense of whether it's the kind of Coca-Cola machine or the Conway Inn, the kind of bar, or, you know, these are places that for a lot of other parts of America, those environments are nostalgic in a way, whereas I think in this particular area they're still very much kind of the place, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's also what I'm interested in. I mean, I don't want to
Yeah.
you know, sort of give it too much of that, because I could also do an entire project on Subarus and Priuses here. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
there's plenty of that here also, but there are those. I mean, even in making the book over the 4 years, like, that Coke machine is gone now.
Yeah.
Like, there's certain things that, I mean, I became acutely aware of when things changed, because I would be like, oh, I'll just go back and rephotograph that if I screw it up. And there's probably more than a dozen times I said that to myself, and I'd go back a week later and it was gone. So, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
there is that stuff that changes, and certainly in a lot of the stories that happened with the people, I noticed that a lot. Like, you know, like I said, there's 2 people that I know of in there have died.
Yeah.
And that was, you know, both not unexpected for either one of them necessarily, but it did speak to that part of it, that things do shift and change. But it's more of just like, you know, like the seasons, you know, and
Yeah.
they come and go.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And I know the book's only kind of been out for a few days or a few weeks, but have you had any particular responses that have really that have really kind of hit you in the heart or the gut? Are there kind of are people responding in the way that you'd hoped, and you know, maybe there's an example or two of kind of responses that you've had that really boost your kind of sense of accomplishment, in a sense of you kind of set out to do this thing and you've kind of done something, or maybe something that might be more surprising, a more surprising response.
I mean, I haven't had, I mean, especially just because it's not, I've been home the whole time while this is coming out, so I haven't had many personal interactions. I had a sort of a really nice moment the other day where I went to pick up food from a restaurant, and one of the people working there is somebody who I've known for a long time, but she had just, you know, mentioned that how they were really excited about the project and about that idea, which I think is like, I think I toe a line here from feeling really nervous about that. And it's particularly, you know, I think it kind of comes up to this center point, which is Greenfield, but there's pictures from all over the county. I mean, I kind of tried to keep it in the county, but that there's, you know, that I get nervous, like the Boston Globe piece that I just read the other day, which very much says Greenfield, 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 and I got really nervous when I saw that, because I don't want people to get too hung up on that. And I've had some people sort of call me out on that too, which is, you know, fair enough. But I think for the most part, the like local response that I'm getting is good. I'm kind of curious to hear more, because it's, you know, it makes it's definitely something that's making me feel nervous, and it's that weird thing where I spent so long on this and feeling like really in it, and then it's out in the world, and then I'm like, what the fuck did I do? I mean, I'm really proud of it and I'm pleased with it, but I think I'm sure to get some responses that aren't as positive, and that's okay, you know.
Yeah.
That's going to be part of it.
I mean, I think you've treated the subject matter and your relationship to it in a really sensitive and thoughtful and caring and heartfelt way. So I think, you know, I don't think from my perspective, I think you've done it justice and you've done yourself justice. And, you know, I think you should rest assured, despite, you know, if criticism comes this way or that, you know, that I think that you know, there's something really deep and important going on in this book, that maybe, you know, is both on the surface and beneath it. But yeah, I think I can only congratulate you for really making a book that certainly kind of hit home for me in both a kind of very literal, but also an incredibly kind of metaphoric and meaningful way. So
Yeah, thanks.
congratulations on that. And yeah, well done. It's beautiful.